Hey everybody, welcome to ATE400. Hopefully you're in the right room today at Microsoft Ignite. For this session today, we're going to talk a little bit about building, deploying, and managing a hybrid environment with Red Hat and Microsoft. And just to note, this is a foundational level 100 session today in the Azure infrastructure track. So hopefully you're in the right room. And again, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are listening to this session or even live right now with us. So just to go over a little bit of the ground rules that we have in this Ask the Experts session. This is different from a traditional session where we talk through a traditional slide deck. This is one where you get to ask questions of us in the Teams interface. So please feel free to use the chat interface to ask those questions and upvote on ones that you want to hear us answer audibly or verbally in the chat session itself. Myself, James, and Vince are here today to field your questions based on the topic. So just a little bit else about the session. This session is being recorded. Please, if you don't mind, don't put spam or comments that you wouldn't ask your family traditionally in the chat session right there. Let's keep it professional as it relates to both the topic matter and Microsoft Ignite. We do take this seriously, and I do have to share with you just for a minute or two here, the Microsoft Code of Conduct. I hope this is not foreign to you. This should be stuff that you have seen before, but if not, please take a few seconds and read what we have on the screen here. Great. I'll take silence as golden and in agreement. Now, for today, I want to introduce a little bit of the panel that will be answering your questions today. I'm going to start with myself, and I'm going to ask my teammates to both say a few words about themselves. So I'll start with myself. Hi, my name is David Cain. I'm a principal engineer in Red Hat's Office of Technology. You can follow me on Twitter. My handle is right there. And I specialize in networking, 5G, data center and edge, and of course, Openshift and containers. And I'm happy to be here today. Vince?
Vince Power. I'm been at Red Hat a couple of years as a solution architect, and my focus is OpenShift, Ansible, and anything cloud. So I'm here to help out and answer any questions people have today. And James.
Thanks, Vince, and hey everybody. James here. So I have been at Red Hat for 10 years now. So my hat is getting a little old and weary by now. But I've been on the Microsoft relationship for 6 years, and I kind of spend all of my time talking to customers about OpenShift on Azure, SQL Server on Azure, about Rail on Azure, and spend pretty much 100% of my time about Red Hat on Azure. So very keen to get any of your questions. And you may be able to tell from accent that I am in the EMEA time zone as well. So we've got both North America and EMEA represented here today. So looking forward to your questions.
Great. And you'll see by the coffee cup that I have here, it's a bit early here in North America, 7 o'clock in the morning, but we're all happy to be here today with questions. But just to talk about through maybe some fair game topics as you're thinking of questions to ask us. This session predominantly was orchestrated really to talk through both the Red Hat and Microsoft relationship. It's a foundational level course or level session that we have here. It's 100 level, but we're happy to go deeper into the topics just as the questions dictate. But to just give folks kind of a background as to what maybe some fair topics here. Here represents just a few areas that we collaborate in that may be of interest to you. James mentioned it, Red Hat Enterprise Linux on Azure. We also have OpenShift on Azure, SQL Server, big data clusters, as well as Ansible. So as you're kind of thinking of questions, these would be topics and areas that are definitely fair game for us to talk to you through. So Vince, maybe let's look at the queue and see if there's a question that you want to start with.
Yep. Let's start with there's a question here for, tell me about SQL Server big data clusters.
Sure. Maybe I'll start that one off. So SQL Server big data clusters at its highest level, it's basically SQL Server 2019 clustered with accessory supporting infrastructure elements for big data and analytics. So Microsoft really paved the groundwork for this in 2016, shocking the world by porting SQL Server to Linux and then later containerizing it. So BDC is really an easy way to deploy a machine learning and training model for big data with open source infrastructure elements. I'm talking like Apache Spark, Hadoop HDFS, Poly-based data visualization natively as a part of the platform. Those data inputs can be external SQL Server instances, Oracle, MongoDB, Teradata. SQL Server 2019 can actually talk directly to HDFS, which brings a lot of disparate data sources together. Really, the end goal of BDC is to give productivity to those data scientists in an enterprise and visibility and governance through your SQL Server DB admin folks. We train the model using the data that I mentioned. It uses standard interfaces that are hopefully familiar to data folks. R, Python, SSIS, MLeap are the supported runtime interfaces here. Again, the basic gist is to spend really more time training models and less time running infrastructure. Kind of a similar story in how we talk about Openshift. What I really love about it is BDC scales with Openshift, the platform, using standard Kubernetes conventions of replica sets. So when you need more compute power, you scale the compute portion of big data clusters. If you need more storage, you can scale those aspects individually, and they scale horizontally. And really, another thing to mention with Openshift, it's that trusted hybrid platform of Kubernetes that does over-the-air updates and upgrades. They're really kind of ideal platforms that work really well with each other. And many folks may not know this, but Openshift is really the first distribution of Kubernetes supported by Microsoft outside of AKS, and Azure Red Hat OpenShift is also supported. So that's kind of a basic overview of BDC, and we're excited to work with Microsoft on that.
Right. We've got another what is question here. It's what is OpenShift? I hear a lot about it.
I can pick that one up then if you like. So OpenShift, yeah. So if you've been following Red Hat or following kind of the container ecosystem for some time, no doubt you've probably heard of OpenShift. For those that haven't, or a bit of an introduction, it is a container platform for modernizing applications. All right. So let me cover off a few little topics or bullet points as part of that. When we're talking about modernizing applications, what we're talking about is maybe taking existing applications or some legacy applications, or even developing new applications, but using a containerized approach for that. You know, those of you who've been in IT for the last 5 years, unless you've been living under a rock, you've probably heard of Docker and containers and Kubernetes, but maybe not so familiar with what some of those things are. But it's a new way to think about applications that uses this concept of Linux containers, if you like, very lightweight virtual machines. Again, you could roughly think of it like that. But it enables you to architect applications that are cloud native, that are very easy to scale, and as you adopt a microservices-based approach. Now, OpenShift is a container platform, so it allows you to build containerized applications, and it brings technologies, again, you've probably heard of, like Docker and Kubernetes and bits and pieces like that, and Linux containers, and puts those all together with a lot of the day two stuff that you need for running containers. So while you might have heard of things like Azure Kubernetes service, OpenShift goes beyond that and adds in things like logging and security and monitoring. One thing that's so important and is so often overlooked is developer integration as well. So it builds a container platform integration into things like Visual Studio Code, into things like Azure DevOps. So it allows developers to very easily adopt a containerized platform. So fundamentally, OpenShift is a container platform for modernizing applications. And again, it's built to run very much on Azure nowadays as well. So while you can run it on-premise and on other clouds, Microsoft was the first cloud where we offer this as a first-party native service. So you can get Azure, Red Hat, OpenShift nowadays and provision this obviously on Azure. You've also got the option to do a self-managed version as well. So that's, we just say OpenShift on Azure, so sort of self-managed, self-installed. So we're giving customers a choice of different deployment options to kind of get OpenShift up and running on Azure. But we've got a super strong relationship with Microsoft, and they see very much a lot of customers, a lot of enterprises adopting OpenShift and choosing to run that on Azure as their kind of their preferred platform. So a lot of good things happening with Azure and OpenShift together, and hopefully that introduces the topic of OpenShift on Azure.
Yeah, just to add a couple points to that for either the business folks or the developer folks that maybe in the audience listening to this, there's really a time to market benefit when you can develop applications maybe much more quickly than you do today with either a traditional waterfall model. James mentioned this a little bit, where you can actually take containerized applications and build processes and iterate over them and promote them from dev to test to staging to production, all with one platform. This really allows you to seize new opportunities in a new market. And the application itself is interesting, and as a developer myself, believe me, I absolutely love the app, but developing that app or new capability and bringing it to market is really what OpenShift enables at its highest level. It eases that path. We can create the same environment in OpenShift for a developer on their laptop that is in production. Really, we can, I mentioned this, promote that from test, dev to staging to production really as part of that platform. It takes that headache out of the development process. We give developers freedom to pick the languages and frameworks that they like Java, PHP, Python, Ruby, Perl, .NET, and they can really focus at what they're good at, programming. And for the operations folks, we really give the ability to monitor and standardize and control that process as much as possible and as securely as possible through a disciplined and standard workflow. And really, what we're really after is bringing to market several capabilities that showcase solution-based offerings. James mentioned this as just some of the comprehensive aspects of the platform where security is built in, got monitoring, logging, standardized build pipelines in there, even integrations through the Azure Service Operator, where you can call native Azure services through OpenShift, Visual Studio Code, having an interface into OpenShift. It's not just a bunch of pieces and parts you have to stitch together, and it's specifically OpenShift on Azure. It's a very stellar experience, whether through a managed service like ARO or OpenShift self-managed, if you wanted to manage the cluster yourself. We work with Microsoft jointly here, both on the development side. We have joint integrated support, so it's one throat to choke. We're not passing the buck and passing your service ticket or problem around between Microsoft and Red Hat. We have a very deep collaboration and engineering teams working together on that managed offering, and broadly OpenShift on Azure. So just a few things to add.
Yeah, well, good stuff.
Okay, this is a little more technical. So how do you move containers from Azure to Azure from on-premise? Is there anything special needs to be configured, and just a very high level?
Right. So if you already have them packaged up as a Docker formatted container image through a Docker file, the like, or if you have a binary build, I would have to ask maybe a follow-up question. Do you have either deployment manifest configured? These are YAML files that are typically fed to orchestrators like Kubernetes, or do you have things written as Helm charts, or even looked at operators specifically? So I guess maybe some more details on the example environment, but generally in principle, unless you're leveraging maybe specialized hardware accelerator devices on-prem that may not be in your cloud environment, typically containers are portable. You have a declarative configuration of everything illustrated as code that can essentially be moved from on-prem to a cloud environment like Azure. But I think maybe not having the complete picture there, that's I'm maybe making assumptions about your environment that I may not know more about.
Yeah, again, chop in there as well, just about container portability. So this is something that I think the community, the general technical community, has been really interested in the development of containers over the last few years. There's big questions about, well, are containers themselves portable? Well, one thing the community has been working on is obviously standardized container format. That's one thing. So theoretically, the container image is the same between two different environments. But there's differences in how you run those containers. If you go to have a Kubernetes environment on premise compared to maybe something differently that you've built in Azure, the way that you maybe start or run or operationalize kind of that container might differ between environments. So it's not so much a question about live migration, it's that is my operational practices similar between both environments, and sometimes they are, sometimes they're not. I mean, this certainly fits into one of the advantages of Openshift, is that you can absolutely standardize those operational practices from on-prem to Azure. Now, we certainly wouldn't say that you can live migrate a container. Very few, well, nobody can really offer this capability today. Containers themselves aren't really live migratable for the most part, but you can certainly standardize those. Again, those operational best practices, have a consistent definition of that container, consistent image between environments. If you're using a platform like Openshift, it allows you to then standardize the operational practices there too. So you've got a consistent environment that's then reliable from on-prem to Azure, or indeed any other environment as well. This is pretty important.
Okay, that's great information. And another question we have here is specific to, can you tell me the difference, a little bit about Azure Red Hat OpenShift, and any major differences with AKS?
Sure, I'll give that a go. So in general, both ARO, that's Azure Red Hat OpenShift, and AKS, that's Azure Kubernetes Service, are Microsoft offerings on Azure. ARO is a managed service offering of Red Hat OpenShift on Azure that I really like to call the easy button, where billing is integrated into a customer's Azure budget and portal, and the deployment is very straightforward through either the Azure portal or the Azure CLI. You just basically say at AZ ARO create, and in the background there's a provisioner that provisions an Azure Red Hat OpenShift cluster in your account. But just overall, just comparing and contrasting the architecture there, ARO includes 3 control nodes. This is the Kubernetes control plane, also the OpenShift control plane there that does a lot of the orchestration and the management of the cluster. 3 worker nodes. It also includes load balancers, local storage, persistent storage classes, a registry, routers. These are both the ingress and egress type routers that are there, and there's really full management of the entire cluster. And what I mean by full management is that there's a site reliability engineering team that's staffed by both Microsoft and Red Hat employees, monitoring your cluster and making sure that things are operating effectively there, and they're also handling the lifecycle and updates and upgrades of that cluster. AKS has a single tenant control plane, which includes the control planes only. A load balancer is included. But the worker itself, it's called, I believe, an agent, an AKS, and then there's optional self-provision services outside of AKS. So it's really just the control plane, and it has a shared responsibility model. The control plane itself is supported by Microsoft, but the workers are vanilla upstream open source Kubernetes, and support here is really community based because it's not a Microsoft distribution. Whereas ARO offers really, like I mentioned, joint Microsoft and Red Hat support, a single throat to choke if we're having a bad day, or a single person to hug if we're having a good day. And there's really end-to-end support from the middleware container image all the way to the host operating system, to the container orchestrator, to the cloud provider. So it's basically the entire stack.
That's good. James, do you have anything to?
No, I think Dave hit it pretty much nail on the head.
Awesome.
I think anything to add on top of that.
Excellent.
Maybe just there's a couple other platform as a service features that may be of interest to folks. You know, I mentioned AKS is open source Kubernetes. There's a bit of a limited UI. There's not routes, there's not source to image, and there's really no project objects. So like I said, there's we'll try not to spend too many differences on AKS versus ARO, but there's just some of the kind of high points between the two services there, just to really inform your decision-making process there. We like to say that Openshift is batteries included with a lot of the developer features and functions and support that's natively built in for that managed service offering. So that's it for me on that.
That's great. Another question we have is, can you run containers on and off premises, and can you manage Openshift across the hybrid environment?
Yeah, sure, Martin. I'll give Dave a break and I'll pick that one off. So absolutely, so you can run containers on premises and obviously on Azure and other environments as well. That's one of the the huge benefits is that containers can run anywhere Linux can run. But this is important to understand that containers between different operating systems will vary a little bit in how they run. And again, I'm going to come back to that operational best practices. So what customers have found is that, they can spin up some containers on-prem, but then they come to go use their Azure environment and, the application works a little bit differently in Azure and we have to configure things differently and all this kind of stuff. That's one of the benefits, again, for going with something like Openshift is that you can standardize that layer, right? Standardize that container runtime between on-premises, Azure, and other environments as well. It means that if you're going to test on-premise before you deploy into production on Azure, you can have the confidence that you've got a consistent environment between both of those platforms, between on-prem, Azure, and so on and so forth. Now, as you start to scale up, we find, or I should say, I find, a lot of customers will have different clusters and different Openshift environments and different containerized applications for different reasons, right? One project team wants things configured in one way, another project team wants to stay separate from another. So traditional enterprise might have multiple Kubernetes clusters and Kubernetes environments, and especially if you're trying to juggle all of those different Azure environments or Azure regions as well as on-premise, you start to then have the question about, well, how do I manage all this, right? How do I not make myself get into some big spaghetti mess trying to manage all these containers? And that's where something like Ansible can help out, but really Red Hat Advanced Cluster Manager really hits that sweet spot and makes that easier for administrators. So Red Hat Advanced Cluster Manager will connect up those environments and will allow you to do not so much live migration, but allow you to scale an application down on premise, drain it down, and then scale it back up and push it bigger in Azure, for example, or maybe balance across 2 different Azure regions. That's one of its functionalities. Another is when we talk about security measures, right? Security, compliance, and governance, right? If I'm going to have 3 or 4 different Azure regions active, running containers and Openshift in my environment, or how am I going to make sure things like, take a basic example, like the password policy is the same on every cluster and make sure that's all consistent. Or let's take something more serious. How do we ensure that the security context constraints for a project matches every different environment? So that's what defines the underlying permissions and privileges of a container. So Advanced Cluster Manager allows you to make these kind of declarations that this is my organizational best practice, this is how I want my security set up, and apply that in a prescriptive way to every cluster so you get consistency. And now administrators are no longer worried, or I should say less worried certainly, about container sprawl, like we had virtual machine sprawl in the past with every VM is a little bit different. With containers, we can actually say, this is the standard, this is the operational best practice, and then apply that consistently to every environment. So that if I am in a situation where I do have workloads that need to be retained on-prem, like test and development or high data security kind of workloads that need to stay on-premise in my cluster, as well as multiple different Azure regions, I can kind of manage those with confidence with a combination of Openshift and Advanced Cluster Manager to kind of glue all those environments together. Hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Yeah. Just to maybe highlight a few things that James said there about, the security aspects of things. I know that was one of the aspects in our session title is to manage a hybrid cloud securely. I tend to think of security as an overall process that has to be continuous, holistic, and integrated. It has to be thought of at the start of a journey in developing an application through a design phase. You should ideally take things in depth from the start, where you choose a platform that has a lot of the security conventions, built into it, really from the start. And I think James highlighted on a couple of those aspects of Openshift specifically, like security context constraints. These are where we don't want containers, which at the end of the day are really processes in Linux for the more technical folks in there. There's a bit more conventions around that to make those scalable on a host, but really, we don't really want to run those containers as root, which is, kind of the privilege 0 user on the box itself, and use SE Linux for those that have heard of that, which really helps us mitigate container runtime vulnerabilities through concepts of labels and file system context on the host itself. And this allows us to really holistically set what containers run at as the box, either the capabilities that they may require or not require in terms of host volumes, those SE Linux contexts, on the container itself, the user ID that they choose, and that kind of boils up into the rest of the platform through role-based access control, identity and access management, really making sure that fits with your organizational security policy and the like. Like with ARO, we have the ability to interface with an Azure Active Directory instance, so everything is, backed by that, hierarchical viewing of users in your cluster itself. So there's not local user IDs. Everything can be, tied back to an identity there. The host itself, we use Red Hat Enterprise Linux Core OS, which is a secure host and a mutable host and a container runtime. And this is the last point I have on this, that really just makes it so you've got that common infrastructure layer on-prem as well as in the cloud, like on Azure. So you have that common layer where you write your app once and you can run it where you choose, because you have that standardized secure hybrid layer that is Openshift.
Right. That's thanks, Dave and James. There's just a couple minutes left in the session. We have some follow-up. We have some action items we'd like people to go through.
Sure. So I think with just a few minutes left, thank you everyone for attending our session. Hopefully this information was useful for you. I just want to call your attention to a single URL. Don't want to blast you with too many links right here, but it's right there at the top. It's https red.ht/msftignite. Please go there. This is a one-stop shop for all things Red Hat at Microsoft Ignite. You can look at other recorded sessions that we may have coming down the pipe. I know Mr. Vince Power has a session that he has pre-recorded that you can get to from there. We also talk a little bit more about ARO, SQL Server on RHEL, Ansible, and then there's another session that I believe that covers SQL Server. Please, there's a raffle. There's a chance to win an Ember coffee mug, which from what I understand is a smart, intelligent coffee mug that allows you to control the temperature of your coffee for up to 90 minutes. That's pretty sweet. It's Red Hat branded. You can also enter in for a gift card. I believe it's $75. There's a few of those to get Red Hat swag. Wish we were there with you where we could give you swag in the booth, but unfortunately we can't. And then really that leads into that URL takes you to our pop-up experience. This is a virtual experience like you're there with us in a booth where you can watch videos, interact with us, ask for a executive briefing center. We're even going to be there staffing the booth. So if we didn't answer your question today, we can take it live there through that pop-up experience. And please, again, feel free to use that. And I believe that about wraps us up for today.
Thanks everybody for your time, and if you have any more further questions, as Dave said, just drop by our virtual booth, and there are lots of people there that can take your questions and find any information you're looking for.
Thanks, everyone. Great to have all your questions. See you around.
Take care, everybody.